This story begins in the middle of the story of Harvest Moon, which is known these days as Story of Seasons. In 2006, after Marvelous had released its 19th game in their flagship Harvest Moon series, Harvest Moon DS Cute producer Yoshifumi Hashimoto created a spin-off series to Harvest Moon with his studio Hakama. This game was called Rune Factory, a fantasy Harvest Moon, a fantasy RPG simulation series borrowing many of Harvest Moon's farming and social gameplay elements. The game features character designs by Minako Iwasaki with music composed by Tomoko Morita. Hashifumi's description of Rune Factory was simple but very accurate. Harvest Moon where you wield a sword. Rune Factory in 2006 was exactly what I wanted for the Harvest Moon series at the time. It had a fantasy setting with a story including enemies, conflict, and combat to mix up the Harvest Moon formula of farming simulation gameplay. The combat did lack a lot of depth, but for its time it was still a dramatic change from the peaceful Harvest Moon games. Players could level up a swordsman's skill and purchase swords, spears, hammers, and axes for combat from the town blacksmith to complete the game's various dungeons to clear the main game. In addition to those action RPG elements, the game also had a farm you could manage, townspeople to engage with, and bachelorettes to potentially marry. Monsters could be tamed and resources could be harvested from them. The game also had time and season elements which determined the crops players could grow. Crops themselves had quality levels resulting in higher sales value for higher quality. Crops could even be grown in the game's dungeons. The game didn't just have farming and swordsmanship though. Skills like foraging, mining, logging, pharmacy, cooking, and fishing among others could be leveled up through use and natural gameplay. Players could also learn useful magic spells to help them. The game's story wasn't anything special or particularly memorable, but it did introduce the Earthmates, who would be the protagonists of the series, and mentioned conflicts that weren't directly related to the game's immediate plot. These conflicts were interesting and had players wondering if maybe future games would explain them more or directly address them as part of the plot. And a few future games actually did. Stardew Valley, in fact, does something similar with a character introduced a year into the game returning from a war. In short, Rune Factory was an action RPG with simulation elements instead of a straight-up farming simulation like Harvest Moon. However, the simulation elements were just as developed as they were in the Harvest Moon games of the time rather than just being optional activities. This resulted in a very interesting game with open-ended gameplay that appealed to people like me who enjoyed a little variety in their action RPGs, and also the Harvest Moon crowd who was more interested in farm management and the cozy social elements of the Harvest Moon games. In fact, after you completed the game's story, you could continue playing the game as you would a Harvest Moon game, even marrying one of the townsfolk if you want. Rune Factory got favorable reviews. It was acknowledged and awarded for its originality, but more importantly, it was clear from the first game that Rune Factory's spin on the formula had the potential to become its own series, and Hashimoto was ready to tap that potential. Minako Iwasaki and Tomoko Morita returned from their respective roles on the first game, and Masahide Miyata directed the new game. This team would go on to continue developing future titles in the series. The next game in the series, Rune Factory 2, A Fantasy Harvest Moon, released in 2008, including generational gameplay and a unique title screen for each generation of the game when the player would start the game. In Japan, the game removed its reference to Harvest Moon in the title to establish itself as its own franchise, but the subtitle remained for the Western localization. The game wasn't as open-ended as the first game and actually gated the player by forcing them to do things like marry another character about halfway through the game to even complete it. For this reason, I didn't enjoy the game as much as the first game that allowed you to mostly play it how you wanted as long as you cleared the dungeons. Nonetheless, the generational gameplay was a unique take for the series and many players enjoyed the game. It was reviewed about as well as the first game. Rune Factory Frontier also released later in 2008 in Japan, 2009 in North America, and 2010 in Europe on the Wii. This game takes place sometime after the first Rune Factory game. The game returned to a more straightforward open-ended gameplay system where progression was largely determined by progress to the story dungeons. It's the first Rune Factory game to be in 3D, but other than that, the core gameplay mechanics are largely the same. The game did have some unique farming features with the Runies, which had mixed reception among its players. Rune Factory Frontier's aggregate review scores were also around the same mark as prior Rune Factory titles, being received generally well. In 2009 in Japan, Rune Factory 3 released on the Nintendo DS and later in other parts of the world. The game featured new AI with dynamic schedules. The main character could transform into a woolly, a sheep-like monster in the Rune Factory universe. My favorite new feature in the game was being able to have villagers join you in battle. There was also a multiplayer mode to let up to 3 other players work together to conquer dungeons. Rune Factory 3 was a very fun game, and while I haven't played Rune Factory 3 Special, the game's remake that released in 2023, I can only imagine is just as awesome with updated graphics and features for the Nintendo Switch and Windows PC. The remake also added a newlywed mode and hell difficulty mode. In 2011, Rune Factory Oceans, known as Rune Factory Tides of Destiny in North America, was released in Japan. This game had you control a male and female as one main character. I personally never played this game, but it was also the first Rune Factory game to be available on a Sony platform. And then came my personal favorite game in the Rune Factory series, Rune Factory 4, released in 2012 in Japan and later in North America and Europe for the Nintendo 3DS. The game had a deep crafting system and added a feature to make orders to the town to influence things in the world. I probably spent the most time in this game's post-game dungeon myself. Hashimoto mentioned this game's theme to be passionate love, sweet marriage. I don't know much about that myself as I play for the action RPG elements, but one thing I was impressed with was Hashimoto's commitment to make the game run at 60 frames per second on the Nintendo 3DS, which made the game's action elements a lot more fun for me. You could also travel with 2 companions, and the living space was more customizable. It was also possible to tame boss monsters, which was really cool. Rune Factory 4 Special, a remake of this game, was released for all the major platforms and eventually worldwide, starting with Japan in 2019. The game added a newlywed mode, hell difficulty, additional movie CGs, and some neat features. I haven't played this version personally since I already own the 3DS version, but if someone wanted to get into the Rune Factory series, this game would be my top recommendation. Rune Factory 3 Special is probably also a great game to start with too. And then comes Rune Factory 5, the game I call an unpolished diamond. I really enjoyed this game, even if it isn't my favorite game in the series, because it has the great aspects of Rune Factory 4's gameplay. So why do I call it an unpolished diamond? It also has a huge and very noticeable performance downgrade compared to Rune Factory 4. And this is despite being on more powerful hardware. The low frame rate, poor graphics, and long loading screens mar what could have been an incredible 3D Rune Factory experience. A same-sex marriage feature was added to the game for its international release, and the player can choose to play as a male or female main character. The game also added team attacks too. Other than that though, the game doesn't really add anything else significant to the Rune Factory formula that Rune Factory 4 doesn't already do, which is why I couldn't really recommend Rune Factory 5 to anybody. The long loading screens in particular really disrespect the player's time. Despite the game's middling reviews and poor performance, it did manage to sell 500,000 units worldwide. It has sold more units than all of the other titles individually, although if you add the sales of Rune Factory 4 Special to Rune Factory 4, that game has actually sold the most copies. I think Rune Factory 5 sales are largely a result of fans just being starved for a new game in the Rune Factory series after so long. This brings us to the most recent and exciting upcoming releases for the Rune Factory series. Marvelous actually announced not one, but 2 more Rune Factory games in 2023 that are currently in development. The first is the next flagship numbered title, Rune Factory 6, which had no details other than that it would take place in the western continent of Adonia. While the other game, which was shown in much more detail in the most recent Nintendo Direct with a spring 2025 launch window, is Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma, which takes place in the east and looks to really mix up and evolve the Rune Factory formula in an exciting way. The first most dramatic change I noticed is that it's a 3D Rune Factory game that actually looks good and seems to have fixed the performance woes of Rune Factory 5, which is extremely important for people looking to actually play the game more as an action RPG than a farming simulator like me. The second is what seem to be town or settlement building features in addition to the standard Rune Factory simulation options of farming and crafting. Instead of your standard Earthmate protagonist, you control an Earth Dancer whose designs are really cool. It seems like their farming methods might be a little different too. I mean, just look at how they water the field. No stinky watering cans in sight. The game also gives you the choice to be the male protagonist or female protagonist. I think the performance improvements and graphics alone give the game a great chance of appealing to a broader audience and bringing newcomers to the series. This could easily become a new breakout game in the Rune Factory series, similar to what Atelier Ryza was to the Atelier series. Series fans still have a lot of questions about this new title, like, will players finally be able to date the Bachelor and Bachelorette's parents or older adults? Only time will tell. Most of the Rune Factory titles also received multiple comics and mangas. A pre-order bonus of the first Rune Factory game in Japan came with a 64-page manga. DNA Media Comics also released an anthology manga on November 1st, 2006 to promote the game. Rune Factory 2 and Rune Factory Frontier received multiple mangas serialized and featured in A-Station, Dengeki Mao, Dengeki Nintendo DS, and Monthly Wings. Rune Factories 3, 4, and 5 had coinciding manga adaptations published in Nintendo Dream magazine as well. Some of these mangas have been fan-translated into English. Rune Factory 2 even got a light novel. In any case, I really enjoy the Rune Factory series for its gameplay variety, and it fits the perfect niche for me by not being strictly a farming simulator. Item, equipment, crop, and ingredient quality levels just add depth to the game's systems too. The games generally just keep getting better with each entry. I still think Stardew Valley will probably always be the best farming simulator game ever made, and it will probably remain that way as long as developer Concerned Ape doesn't stop developing the game and continues improving it. The game's so good, I'm not crazy about farming sims, and even I can enjoy playing it. Probably because there are dangerous places to explore and there's some action snuck into that game. The truth is, big publishers prefer releasing new farming sims with the same stale gameplay to just making their games better, which is why I personally could never get into the pure farming sims like Harvest Moon and Story of Seasons. While Rune Factory 5 is an unpolished diamond, Square Enix's Harvestella is what I consider a polished turd. It has the great graphics and performance Square Enix releases are known for, but it lacks the amazing blend of gameplay that Rune Factory games have. Every other game with strong farming elements has seemed like a clone of either Rune Factory, Story of Seasons, or Stardew Valley. Although I do want to give a special mention to Sakuna of Rice and Rune, which is a great action RPG with much heavier emphasis on its action gameplay than its rice farming simulation elements. Although the farming systems do work to increase Sakuna's strength in that game. Rune Factory's unique world setting, characters, and increased emphasis on action RPG elements are what make me continue to come back to the series with its new releases. I may not be the hugest Rune Factory fan, but I'm glad to see Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma appear to evolve the series to new heights. Heck, with its spring 2025 launch window, it might even become a launch title for Nintendo's next generation console. And I'm still excited to see what Rune Factory 6 has in store for everybody in the future as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.